At the start of 2024, I came into a coaching offer doing anywhere from $100,000 to $300,000 per month. The revenue was fluctuating. There was about a 15 to 20 person team, most of whom were on the fulfillment side of things. Now, fast forward to 2025 of working on this offer, the offer has hit its first $1 million month in September and now has over 60 people on the team. And that's not revenue, that's cash collected. And in this video, I'm going to pull back the curtain on what it takes to actually go from being stuck in the low six-figure range to hitting a seven-figure month. I'm going to break down every single step sequentially that we took in order to grow the company and break down the reasons behind them and behind taking those steps. And regardless of where you're at right now with your coaching business or your offer, there's going to be things from these steps that you can take and implement into your own coaching business so that you can scale and hit those seven-figure months yourself. And that's because I'm going to cover how we optimize and manage the entire setting process to hit a 15% booking rate on cold traffic with a 17-person setting team, how we achieved upwards of a 60% plus reply rate on completely cold traffic, all the automations that we set up to make the entire sales process streamlined and more efficient, all the data that we tracked and made decisions from that led us to scaling, how we leveraged our emails to generate upwards of 10% of our revenue from our newsletter, how we actually optimized and managed the dialing team, how we optimized our entire funnel to convert upwards of 2 to 3% of every lead that came into the funnel into a paying client, the low ticket funnel that we ran, our entire pre-call process that led to a consistent 80 to 90% show rate, as well as how we dialed in our back end to ascend upwards of 70% of our front end customers into a $9,000 upsell and increase our LTV. By the way, this is in the fitness space, and much, much more. I didn't leave a single stone unturned in this video, so if you can sit still and pay your undivided attention to this entire video, there's a very, very high probability that there's going to be a few actionable steps and takeaways that you have that you can directly implement into your business by the end of this video in order to scale. Now, before I jump into the actual seven-figure breakdown, I do need to mention that my role in this company was specifically focusing on directing acquisition and driving as much revenue as possible. I was responsible for the entire sales process, the actual acquisition systems, the setters, the dialers, the tech management, the tracking, the automations, the funnel itself, and the overall team management in the company. And when I came into this company in 2024, the closing team was already being managed by a very talented team lead, as well as actually the face of the brand, the creator behind this offer, who is brilliant at sales and has taken over 10, maybe 15,000 sales calls on his own offer. So he was focused on directing the closing team. The face of the brand was also responsible for the front end content, as well as the ads and ad copy. There was also an amazing organic marketing director in place who's responsible for taking care of all the organic channels. So that's YouTube, Instagram, our email list, as well as actually managing the entire creative team and the editors. There was a tech team in place responsible for all the automations and integrations in the company, in the business. There was a very talented media buyer who does the media buy-in and actually runs the ads and the ad campaigns. And lastly, there are two brilliant fulfillment team leads who are essentially managing the coaches, leading the coaches, and making sure it's the best product in the market. Now, with that being said, let's get into the $1 million per month offer breakdown. Right, so the first thing I want to start with is just kind of breaking down what I just broke down, right, with the org chart. So in terms of the team organization, when I came in, and this is kind of how it's also structured right now, there's just more people in every department. There's obviously the fulfillment team leads taking care of the coaching side of things. There's sales management, there's the media buying, and then there's an organic marketing director, as well as a tech team who's responsible for all the automations as well as tech and essentially implementing those, turning ideas for automations into reality. And then there's the offer owner as well as me, right? And this is kind of how the management overlaps and how it works. Now, the next thing I want to break down is the funnel, right? The funnel that took us to $1 million a month, primarily this funnel. And that funnel is a free community funnel, right? And this is something that's worked completely with cold traffic, with an ad creative promoting a free community. Then from there, people go into a free community opt-in page just like this. This is an old page, and I'll kind of talk about how we optimized this and doubled at a point our opt-in rate on this page. Pretty much lowered our cost of acquisition in two. But the leads get sent to Allower for SMS after opting in. And then from here, we have setters, right? Setters are the primary source of revenue on this offer. Okay, so setters are the primary revenue generators, you can say, because they're the ones who are converting people from just being leads who join this free community funnel to being calls who then the closers convert into actual paying customers, right? And that's why the setters, when I came into this offer, became the number one priority, right? Optimizing the setting team and dialing in the setting department. And later on, this bridged into other priorities, right? Like the actual organic marketing bottlenecks and what we did there, the tracking, everything I'm going to cover in this video, right? But let's jump back into the setting because this was generally the first thing that was solved. And I would say it was probably one of the highest leverage things. And most businesses at scale, at 100K a month, 200K per month, a million a month, or even 10K per month, this is something they lack, right? They lack a proper dialed in setting process. So in terms of setting bottlenecks, the first thing was there was no KPI tracking, right? Again, this was a offer doing low 6 figures per month. There was not really a proper KPI tracking with the setting team. So there was no data to actually scale with. There was no feedback loop of data of what was happening in the setting team. The next thing was the setters just were over-reliant on scripts. They were copying and pasting entire conversations, and this led to dry and shallow conversations and a high drop-off rate. The next thing was there was no performance benchmarks. So the setters were absolutely just not being held accountable for their actions. The next thing, right, the fourth problem was there was an inefficient booking process. Leads were being qualified post-booking through a type form. So instead of getting qualified in the chat, as that's a little bit more efficient, and I'll talk about how we actually did that without directly just telling people about the cost of the program, and I'll get to that in a second. But instead of doing that, the leads would get booked on a call, then they would get sent to a type form, and then if they were qualified, they'd stay on and they'd have a call with the closer. If not, they would get canceled. It wasn't very efficient. And then from there was no recruitment process. So if a setter was underperforming, there was no way to essentially easily let go of them and replace them with a better performer. There was no way to find qualified setters, and there was no standardized training to actually ramp people up. That was another problem. If a setter left who was essentially a low performer or not the best performer, there was no really dialed in process to just put a setter in place, get them up to speed in 1 to 2 weeks and be good to go, right? It took a month, it took more, right? So the way we started solving this was with the very first problem, which was dialing in our KPI tracking, right? So first thing was setting up a setter tracker. We needed to track how many shifts were they working, the hours they put in, the leads, the times, the amount of calls they pitched, which is times offered, the links they sent, the calls confirmed, the sales every setter made. And then from there, we tracked some of the lower metrics, which would be the amount of calls they booked per shift, the amount of sales they got per shift. This was the most important metric, and I'll explain why. The amount of leads they offered times, and the amount of leads a setter was able to convert into calls as well as sales. From here, we analyzed that at the end of the day, the highest revenue driving metric was sales per shift. Because if you pause the video here and you look at this sheet, this is an actual sheet from when we came into the offer. There were setters who were working 2 times less and were making the same amount, if not more sales than someone who was working 2 times more than them. So our main focus was sales per shift, even though you can argue that, yes, the setters aren't directly responsible for the sale, right? Because that's something the closer does. The setters were responsible for building the rapport, building the pain to book someone onto a call, building enough pain for them to actually show up to the call and making sure they show up to the call. And of course, just booking as many calls as possible, converting as many leads as possible. So that became the main metric that we started using to actually track and manage and improve the setting team. And when we looked at that metric at the time, we took the team average of the setters sales per shift, and it was about half a sale per shift, 0.55 sales per shift. And another average metric we looked at, which is just a trend that I spotted, was that these top performing setters who were performing above average were sending more messages per day. Now, this doesn't mean they were having 500 conversations per day. It just means all messages combined. So follow-ups, conversation messages, most of it did come from follow-ups. So I'm just grinding it out and sending more follow-ups, right? The money is in the follow-ups. And after that, noticing that pattern, that is also a standard we set. And that became the performance benchmark, getting 0.55 sales per shift, as well as 500 messages sent per day. And this is very offer specific, right? On a different offer, this number could be 200 messages per day. This was just solely based on the amount of leads we were getting and the amount of leads every setter was getting individually, as well as, of course, the team averages. From there, another thing was setter shifts. We initially implemented setter shifts that were 8 hours long, because before that, setters would just feel free to hop on, hop off, and leads were just getting missed. So that hole was plugged. The next thing for keeping the setters accountable and setting a performance benchmark was a 2-week probation period. So all the setters who were below the team average, if they couldn't break that team average of half a sale per shift after 10 shifts, which would be about 2 weeks of work, right? If they didn't work weekends or if they just took 2 days off per week, they would be let go, right? So that became a probation period for all the low performers. And that also raised the standard because we started letting go of low performers who couldn't average that, right? And then our average just kept climbing up because the high performers would remain, and that half a sale per shift is just an average, right? Combining both low and high performers. So if it was just the higher performers, that average just jumped up with them. The qualification of the entire team was also increased because moving forward, the lowest performer would be replaced pretty much on a monthly basis, right? So if someone was a bottom performer and if it recurred for 2 months, even I would say 5 to 6 weeks, right? Week over week, it just keeps happening, they would be replaced. Then other thing to just systemize this entire process was standardizing the training. So the lowest performer would redo the training if they were performing poorly and get daily conversation reviews of what they were doing in order to improve, right? So they would have this 2-week probation period. And during this period, it wasn't just like throwing them in the ringer and saying, you got to perform. No, they had to go through the course, right? So we gave them a chance, essentially. They had to go through the course, which was on them, right? And then they would get daily conversation reviews. And typically, if they actually went through the training and watched the daily conversation reviews, they ended up performing better, right? You see how that works. So after that, the next thing we solved was building a consistent recruitment process, right? There was no way to find qualified setters and no way to just train them and have a repeatable training process for them. So recruitment and training became the next step in fixing this problem, right? The setter problem. And so we built a VA system where the VAs would run mass hiring campaigns in Facebook groups and post about 50 to 60 posts a day, right? So we would just get this application stacked with people. This hiring process also got replicated for the closers because this entire system got passed on to the closing team because there was also bottom performers and that standard needed to be raised. And if you're watching this and you've hired setters before and you kind of know about these setting Facebook groups, you might be thinking, well, most of the Facebook group talent is just bad. And that is very true, right? Which is why I'm going to get into how we actually qualify that talent in a second here. But when someone would be brought on into the form, right, and then they were qualified, they'd be put through a standardized training just like this, where it was completely step-by-step. It was just an easy SOP to follow with these drop-downs. Every single setter coming into the company would be forced to go this. This was about 4 to 5 hours of training to make sure there was absolutely nothing missed and they were absolutely clear on their job responsibilities and how to actually manage them. When that setter would come in, just like having a low performer on the team, right? We started letting go of low performers. A new setter would have a 2-week trial or probation period where they would have to hit half a sale per shift, consistently send 500 plus messages, ramp up with the system in order to stay on the team. And then if they were not a performer, right, if they got fired, which would happen as well, we had setters on the bench always ready to go to replace those poor performers. Pretty much a database, which was again created because of the sheer volume of applicants we got from a VA system hiring from Facebook groups. This completely solved the recruitment bottleneck, right? We never had to worry about this again. Now, in terms of the training itself, the biggest things in terms of training these setters was having a video explaining what we do and how it actually contributes and how it helps people, because we wanted the setters to be sold on the actual idea of the company, right? This wasn't just like a money hungry thing. We wanted to sell them on the mission. And the mission was pretty powerful. We saved multiple people's lives because of the weight loss. That's what this offer did. The next thing was for the setters to actually watch some of the audience-focused content, which I'm going to get into what that looked like, but it was mainly going to our YouTube channel, watching some of the testimonials, watching some things in the Facebook group. They also got a general training on how to sell in the specific industry. Then we made sure that they're aligned with all the expectations of them having to hit the target KPIs, all the workflows and automations they would use. And they would also see examples of successful conversations. This later bridged into something even better because what we had happen down the line in this entire training process to make it even more efficient and just better, right? And make sure that when reps start, they're just able to reach competency as fast as possible. We started having new setters as well as new reps shadow high performers on the team, right? So they would shadow them for 3 days. They would jump on a Google Meet call for 3 to 4 hours, watch them do their thing, right? Ask any questions they had. And this, of course, happened after, they've gone through the training and the script, so they kind of understood what's going on. But this would remove any sort of confusion. It would remove any sort of back and forth. And when they would actually start setting themselves, they would be up to speed on the entire offer and the setting process and how it works. Now, the qualification process with hiring from Facebook groups is super important. The first thing that helped us qualify was the actual hiring form. It was a 5-step form, right? And we qualified a few things. Main one was experience, right? So in the application form, we got them to send a loom, and they were prompted on what to talk about in this loom, right? It wasn't just about their experience. It was also about their mindset and their kind of reasoning behind setting entirely. You need to make sure someone's hungry, right, when they join their team, so they don't just half-ass their role. The other thing we qualified was competence. In the application form, there was a link to a test, literally an IQ test, where we would make sure that the setters have high critical thinking skills. We would typically target people with 110 IQ plus. They would perform really, really well in the setting team. We noticed a trend where if they were over 110, 115, we also noticed a trend. We gave this IQ test, it was pretty funny, to all the top performers on the team, right? So people above the average who were smashing the average. We found out their IQs and the average was like 115. So we set that as the bare minimum to actually join the team, and we just got more competent people. The other thing was, because Facebook groups don't always have, the best talent, as I explained, a lot of the talent is from third world countries. We also made them do an English test, which is a written and a hearing test, and they would have to score 90% plus on both the hearing and the written test, right? Or sorry, the speaking and the written test. And typically, only about 1 to 2% of all applicants from these Facebook groups made it through their interview. And then, of course, we had a VA actually look over the English test results and the IQ test results and just delete any applications that would score under 115, and just delete any applications that would score under 115 or applications that scored under 90% on 2 of the English tests. There was also a few additional trainings for a fast ramp-up period of new talent, which was a script breakdown, extremely detailed 30-page script. This also had manual follow-ups they could use after every single message in the script to avoid ghosting. They had objection handling, and during this whole process of them actually coming onto the team and doing their thing and setting, they would get daily convo reviews, right? So not only would they get the shadowing session, they would get the training, they would get all these things. When they actually came in and worked that 2-week probation period, every single day they got a conversation review in order to improve. And a big thing that was paid attention to there was, were they actually able to implement, were they taking action on the things that we were asking them to implement in order to better their conversations. Now, the last thing with recruitment was selling them on the vision, right? And that doesn't mean selling them on the mission, right? And making sure they have kind of their own mission and their own reason why, and they have hunger. It was selling them on the vision of progress in the company. So we had a system of progression, right? When someone would come in as a VA, if their English was competent and, let's say they're from a third world country, they would be able to progress into a DM setter after 3 months. And from a DM setter, they had a chance to progress into a team lead. Of course, with all these, the financial incentive increases. Same thing with phone setters, which I will talk about in another section. The phone setters would go from being cold phone setters calling follow-up leads to being phone setters that are calling warm leads, to them being able to become a team lead or a closer, right? Again, financial incentive increases with all of these, as well as skill progression increases, right? For some of these people, it's just all about growth, or at least that's a big reason why they do what they do. Now, in order to solve our drop-off because of the poor booking process, as well as just dry and, bad conversations, for lack of a better word, we looked at a few things, right? The first thing was, what were these setters doing, right? We looked at the problem. So the setters were spamming Control+V, right? They're just pasting messages. And whenever they tried to send good messages, whenever they would be called out on their behavior, they would have very slow reply times and just couldn't manage the lead flow. So instead of just blaming the setters, we looked at what's behind this, right? And we found these little bottlenecks. The first one was there was too many leads for the setter to handle, for every setter per individual setter to handle. These setters had no leverage. Because of that, they would get overworked, and they were also being under incentivized. So the first thing we did to solve this was setting up a lead range per setter. We measured our reply rate drop off compared to the time it took to reply, and set a standard of a 2-minute average setter response time to every single lead that responds to us, right? So we needed these conversations to move faster. The biggest needle mover for this was automations, which I'll talk about here in a second, and limiting every setter to 40 to 50 new leads per day. This is where we tracked and noticed that the setters performed at their best. Then the next thing we did is we created an unreplied inbox so that setters would be able to reply to leads as fast as possible and do it within this 2-minute time frame. The next thing was recruiting more setters through the recruitment process that was built out because, again, they were overworked. And with the setting team we had, which was about 5 to 6 people, at one point it was even 4, right? In 2024, when this entire optimization process started, this wouldn't have been hit, right? The setters were managing up to 70, 80 leads per day at some points. And then the next thing was, instead of having them copy and paste messages and essentially just spam messages, we started creating personalized templates for efficiency. This is within Alloyware, right? We were using Alloyware and still using Alloyware for all of the setter management, the DMs, right? Talking with leads, lead communications. So we started creating templates for efficiency to lead to faster responses and consistent messaging. So instead of the setters doing manual follow-ups, we decided to automate them, right? These conversations were happening through SMS, and they were happening through Alloyware, which has a great interface for automations. And the very first automation we set up was speed to lead for new leads, right? So instead of counting on the setters to message every single new lead within 2 minutes, we just set up an automation that would send that first message, which is something that increased our reply rate because of faster messaging and decreased human error. And then we actually set up more sequences, which I'll go through here, and use the VA to actually help the setters do the follow-ups, right? Because if you think about it, the highest leverage task a setter can do is having a personalized conversation, right? It's not doing follow-ups. Yes, follow-ups are important, which is why we set this up, but it's having a personalized conversation with every single person they speak to, because that's what's actually going to lead to the highest booking rate possible. So for these, there was a few primary follow-up sequences we set up. The first one was a new convo follow-up, which essentially meant if someone came in, they got this 2-minute speed to lead text and they never replied to us, there was a 3 to 5 day sequence that would just text and email them in order to get them back into the conversation. With this, we got our 24-hour reply rate up to 30 to 40%, and we got our 7-day reply rate to 60, 70%, roughly doubled from 30, 40%, right, over 7 days, because this was a 3 to 5 day sequence. The next one was mid-convo follow-up 1. There was also a variant of this, mid-convo follow-up 2. This was a 3 to 5 day sequence that would reach out to leads who ghosted us mid-conversations. Before, the setters would have to remember that someone ghosted them, then do the follow-ups. This would lead to human error. Then after this was set up, when sending every message, the setter would enroll a person into the mid-convo sequence before they would click send. And if the prospect would go silent, the automation would follow up with them every single day for 4 days. And if they would respond, the setter would take over again. Times offered, no booking. This one is pretty clear, right? So after a setter pitched the call, if the person didn't choose a time or reply, they were enrolled into the sequence automatically, and the sequence would essentially push them to book a call. This also replaced the admin team who was in charge of, managing post-booking messages and making sure leads actually show up to calls, because it took care of those follow-ups for them. The next one was for canceled leads, right? This was a 3 to 5 day sequence, sending texts and emails, as well as having phone setter calls. All of these had phone setter calls, and I'll talk about a dialing team and how that was optimized for this in a bit. But before, there was no process, no shows were just lost, and this led to no shows actually rescheduling. And then if someone never replied from any of these sequences, which were the primary follow-up sequences, they would go into a setter follow-up forever sequence, which was a quasi-periodic follow-up sequence, which means it would just randomly send follow-ups every 5 to 10 days, and it would just never stop. It would follow up with them for months. The whole goal with this sequence was the understanding that, like, if we don't help these people make a change, they're not going to make a change themselves, right? The other thing we added to all of these sequences a little bit down the line was adding a voicemail drop. So for them, it looked like we called them, and it was just a creator saying, hey, I called you because you were in the middle of a conversation with me, and it seems like something happened, right? Or if it was a new convo, hey, I saw you opted into this group, and I owe you some free trainings, but I didn't hear back from you. Hope everything's okay, right? And by the way, I do have to mention, the entire time, the leads were thinking they were speaking to the creator. They didn't know that they're speaking to a setter, which is why these voicemail drops worked. Now, one thing we also did, because these sequences would typically start 18 to 24 hours after, right, giving a chance for the leads to reply, there was also a 2 and a 4 hour personalized follow-up setup that the VA would do based on the last question before the follow-up automation launched. All right, so if the question was, how much weight do you need to lose? Then, and the person didn't reply within 2 hours, the VA would follow up and, for example, say, do you need to lose 1 stone or more? Or do you need to lose 20 pounds or more? There was also a failed sequence, which I want to do a deeper breakdown because most people just don't do this. Now, to go a little bit into the actual failed sequence and what that looked like, because as I said, most businesses do miss this part. And it's essentially recuperating lost sales, right? So by lost sales, I mean calls that essentially don't close, failed calls. And the way I see it is with failed sales calls, there's a buy-in scale, right? There's a few reasons that people typically not buy. It's typically one of these 6 reasons, right? There's price, which can be because of the value. There's the timing, not the right time. That's an objection. There's authority, trust, where they literally don't trust you or they don't see you as an authority who can help them. There's competitors, right? Other competitors who maybe they perceive as someone who's better at the service than you or cheaper. And there's also understanding. They're just not really clear on the offer. Maybe your closer doesn't do the best job on a call, right? And they don't close. Or your closer just doesn't tailor the call to like the specific person, right? That could happen as well, where the closer is trying to run through the typical sales pitch, and for one person it just doesn't click, right? That's where we have the actual failed recuperation sequence. These need to be real objections for the sequence to work, right? So it can't be a smokescreen. Otherwise, the sequence might not work as well. So your closer actually need to get to the core objection. But even if it is a smokescreen, it is better than nothing, right, to have the sequence. So when you lose sales calls, typically you can't tip someone's buying scale, right? The objections outweigh whatever you're selling to them. So when this happens, you don't actually lose the sale, right? You lose the call, but you don't lose the sale because you can go back to this scale. You can recuperate this person. And that's done through the post-call sequence. And the reason for this is because when a sales call is lost, you are actually in the best position possible to recuperate that person because you have the most leverage, right? When you have a start of conversation, right, you first know the lead, you have the least amount of leverage. You don't have any information on them, right? When the sales call happens, you know the objections, you know their specific pains, you know their goals, right? The closer had a call with them. And so you just need to apply that leverage. And the way we did that was through a 15-day win-back sequence, where we position ourselves as the authority, right, from the face of the brand sending, or at least to the person, it looks like the face of the brand sending this message. We collect their feedback and we provide value, right? So let's actually dive into what this looks like. 24 to 48 hours after the call, we'll send emails and text messages. You could use calls, but at this point, people will, if you just call them, like they'll assume that you're trying to close them, right? Typically, that's what happens. So with our field sequence, we specifically focus on emails and text messages. And as you can see, the first message is a feedback message, right? I would appreciate your honest feedback. I apologize that the program didn't make you confident enough, comfortable enough, and certain enough to make your decision. From there, follow up, right? Typically, if the closer did lose the call, or even if they, by losing the call, right, I mean, they didn't get to the bottom of the call, or even if they did get to the bottom of the call, the person will reply with why they didn't close here, where you say the feedback. This could be, it's too expensive, right? This could be, it's just not the right time. From here, you have leverage to get them on another call. If someone said it's too expensive, we literally offer them a scholarship, which was a discounted payment plan, same amount, discounted payment plan. And we got them back on a call and we got them closed, right? From there, we go into value. We send them more results, right, to build more trust and position ourselves as an authority. And then we actually send a scholarship message, because typically if someone doesn't close, it could be price. A lot of the times it's going to be price, right? And even if it's another objection, if they get a better deal, they'll reconsider it, right? So we then send them a scholarship message, right? They could get this deal. And all of these messages here and emails are meant to prompt a reply, right? From there, we get them back on a sales call and we close them. We were able to recuperate 5 to 10%. Typically it was around 5 to be transparent, of lost deals, right? And over a period of a month, 2 months, 3 months, that adds up. That's just revenue that you would have never seen if you don't have this sequence. And then if they just don't close, the 15-day sequence ends. They go into that forever follow-up sequence that just keeps messaging them on a quasi-periodic basis. The whole point of the sequence is for the setter to be able to reoffer them, get them on another call, right? And the reoffer, again, it could either be a promotion, scholarship, spouse discount, right? If it was a partner objection, well, we'll actually do a spouse discount, right? Sometimes it's works, sometimes it doesn't. Reoffering another call with their spouse and offering a special deal if they show up. You can be creative with this. It does work. It works great. And it just generates cash that you would have never seen otherwise. Now, also, before moving on past the follow-ups, one more thing to touch on. Now, before moving on from the follow-ups, one more thing to touch on is just the overall structure and framework behind all of the follow-up sequences, right? This is super important because the way you design every follow-up sequence needs to be congruent. And the other thing, and by congruent, I mean your positioning, right, in those follow-up sequences needs to be congruent. And of course, it needs to give people a reason to reply, right? So when the setters were doing manual follow-ups before the automations came in, they would follow up with something like this, just following up with Uname, just checking in with Uname. You might as well tell them, right, that you're there to just take their money. Instead, we started repositioning, reframing the follow-ups. Hey, just had some time to get back to you. Hey, just had some time to circle back on XYZ. And what this removes is sales resistance. The other thing that was crucial with the follow-up process was framing the follow-ups as value-based. You're trying to help them because they need you. You're not there to take their money, right? So the way this works is instead of constantly asking, are you still interested? You start following up on relevance. You stop using general content in the follow-ups. You stop doing mass market, mass broadcasting follow-ups, and you stop assuming things in the follow-ups, right? So is this weight loss still a priority to you? Do you still need to lose X amount of weight? And then in terms of the follow-up structure itself, once you reframe your follow-ups to be value-based, like for example, in the mid-convo, we would send people a completely free training, right? There was the second or the third follow-up. Hey, you mentioned you've been struggling for X amount of time. Or hey, I have this new training. It's going to be perfect for you if you need to lose 1 to 3 stone. Or hey, I have a new free training on how you can drop 2 dress sizes in the next 90 days. You're going to get some actionable steps from this, right? Big goal here was to focus on increasing consumption with the follow-ups, because a lot of the times in this specific offer, people would ghost us just because of lack of trust and the lack of them believing that we can actually help them. They've been scammed and conned a lot of times. They failed a lot of times in the past. So when we would increase consumption and position ourselves that way, that would recuperate them. And pretty much all the follow-up sequences were structured the same way. 18 to 24 hours after they would ghost, they would get an email and a WhatsApp message. 36 hours later, email, phone call, WhatsApp message. And this also includes a text, by the way. 72 hours later, another cycle, and then it would keep going into day 4 or day 5. And there's, of course, the voicemail drops, right? And I'm going to speak about the phone call and what we did with WhatsApp. It's pretty crazy and pretty cool in a little bit here. And I'm going to speak on what we did with the WhatsApp and the phone calls in a bit here because it's pretty cool. Now, one last point to touch on what generated a ton of money for us before we move on from the follow-ups is reactivation sequences, right? If you're running paid ads and you have a huge pipeline, or even if you have a lot of leads coming in from organic, and a lot can literally mean a few dozen a day, right? These leads stack up. And by leads, I mean you have their number, their email. This could be even done with just Instagram DMs. What most people do is if someone doesn't convert, they'll follow up 3 to 4 times and they will just forget about them. But they fail to consider that these leads, especially if you're running ads, these are people you paid money for. And they also fail to consider that typically if someone doesn't get help, right, the problem they're experiencing, whether it's weight loss, whether it's not making money, whatever niche you're in is, and typically coaches fail to consider that the problem that their leads are experiencing, right? If they reached out to them once, right? Or if they opted into something, that problem will keep getting worse if they don't get help, whether it's weight loss, making money, whatever it is. With time, that problem usually doesn't get any better for most people, which is why we set up reactivation sequences. We ran reactivations on old leads every single month, week, and then we actually did it on a daily basis where we would run reactivations of a few hundred leads because we had a pipeline of like 200,000 leads that just ghosted us, right? Didn't convert, didn't book a call, and they were just sitting there. We then generated replies, the setters would take over, and this increased our ROAS because we already paid for these people, right? They were just sitting there. The entire sales team got an opportunity to generate sales without there being new leads coming in. And this is, again, because while most people forget about their old leads that are just sitting in the pipeline, when you do text blast your leads, it is just free money. And it's also extremely useful if you run paid media to grow your business, because if you have an ads drop or maybe there's a dry period, you're switching something up, you can always recover from it or just maintain your revenue by just running reactivations. It's almost like an emergency button. Now let's go back to the actual setter optimization and how we made them more efficient. The next bottleneck was them being overworked. Right? So with more setters, we changed the shifts from being 8 hours to 5 hours and 20 minutes. This was only possible because we had a constant recruitment system. So we just get pretty much unlimited 8-player setters. And the reason we did this is because we wanted the setters to be locked in for the time they were working, right? So the setters with this, they stopped running a marathon and they started running a sprint when they were working. They wouldn't get fatigued and they wouldn't lose focus towards the end of their 8-hour shift. They were forced to make more out of the opportunity they had in that 5 hours and 20 minutes. And with that, their performance shot up. Kind of a funny way I personally looked at it was, when you drink coffee, the half-life of caffeine is like, 5-6 hours. You're going to get the maximum effects in 4 hours, right? So if they're working 8 hours, they drink a cup of coffee before their shift. By the time they're done, it's done, right? Like they don't have any caffeine in their system. They're sluggish, they're tired. So that was a bro science way of going about it and decreasing their shift times. But obviously we also backed it with data. Now the next bottleneck after the setters being overworked was them being under incentivized. So setters were being paid an unconditional $1,000 base. It was 800 pounds, right? And that's like 1,000 to 1,100, depending on the currency conversion at different times. Plus, they would receive 3.5% commissions on all the sales they made. And this just led to fat cat setters, right? Because the base was unconditional. So regardless of their performance, the effort wasn't being rewarded equally, right? Someone who was a top performer and someone who's a bottom performer would pretty much get the same base. They had the same incentives. Yes, the top performer would make more from commissions, but the base essentially guaranteed that, they'll be chilling every month regardless of how they perform. So what we did instead is we kept the commissions the same, right, at 3.5% per sale. Now, the thing we changed was the $1,000 conditional base was set at 12 sales per month. The reason we set it at 12 sales per month is because it aligned with that half a sale per shift metric, right? If you have 2 days a week that you take breaks, which is what the setters were doing, right? They would work typically 5 days a week, sometimes 6. That's 24 shifts per month, right? So they were forced to make half a sale a day in order to hit their base within the month. And the other thing we did, we started giving them bonuses at $100 at every 8 sales. So when someone would hit 8 sales, that counted as 9 sales. It was essentially like an additional sale, right? When they hit 16, 18 sales, that counted as 18 sales, and that's the way they were paid. When they hit 24 sales, that counted as 27 sales. And this just gave every setter a bigger reason to just keep pushing. We also did something similar with the sales team because every single weekend we had a large dip in revenue because there were just not enough slots, right? So we made the weekends required when hiring new closers. That was something that was framed in the closer recruitment process. And then we actually started giving them bonus commissions for weekend closes, right? We started incentivizing it. And then once this entire setting process was built out, something we did is we offloaded everything to a setter manager. The setter manager was hired as a setter team lead, right? It was not necessarily a manager who was just kind of sitting there and just watching what the setters were doing. It was a top performing setter. And this guy was still in the trenches. And the reason we chose that over hiring just a setter manager who sits around and watches the DMs every day is because the setter manager was in the DMs every day. He would notice lead fluctuations. He would notice everything that was going on. He was working on shifts with other setters, so he would see if they're slacking. And that just created a much faster feedback loop because if we made any changes to the script, if we made any changes to the funnel, anything, we'd be able to hear from him because he was on the front lines. And of course, this setter team lead managed performance. He ran the training, he optimized the booking process, and he held the setters accountable. And then to help him with holding the setters accountable, there was something else we did, right? We started creating a team accountability structure. And the way I saw this is, there's 2 types of reinforcement. You have positive and you have negative. Typically, I outweigh negative reinforcement with sales team, which is why we created all these incentives here. And through the entire process, we were just trying to make the setters' lives as easy as possible. And this is also how we were able to change some of the OG setters' behavior if they were low performers or if they weren't going along with the new changes, because there was a lot of changes to optimize the process. And something we used was just showing them the numbers. I found that that's literally the best thing to just do with sales reps, right? Some sales reps can have a high ego or they'll be making money, they're chilling, right? But if you show them the numbers that they're underperforming or they're doing something wrong and you can actually back it with data, they can't really argue with it. And if they do, they just get let go. Now, another place to hold setters accountable was the calls they were booking, right? So we were struggling with setters just booking a bunch of shit calls on the calendar. And this is what caused us to set up an accountability channel where the setters were held accountable by the closers on the team. So in this accountability channel, there was 25 people, literally the entire sales team. And whenever a closer would get a clearly unqualified lead on a call, they would post it on the channel and tag the setter. The setters were forced to explain why they made this mistake and how they're going to avoid repeating this. And the effect this had is public accountability, right? No one wanted to be called out in that channel with 25 other sales reps and look retarded. And the other effect that this had was not only was the setter that was in question getting held accountable, everyone else who was in that channel, all the other sales reps also saw the message, right? They would see this channel, they would see the mistake the setter made, like the other setters. They weren't willing to get called out in that channel themselves, so they wouldn't make that mistake themselves. This is more of an example of negative reinforcement. And another thing we did to improve quality was literally just adding messages to the script that would clearly qualify someone. And we just had a list of disqualification standards, what would make someone qualified or disqualified. And we made these lists based on data, right? We were able to track down that people under X amount of weight to lose were 2 times less likely to close. This is a real stat we tracked down. And we also discovered that people making under 30K per year couldn't afford the front end offer. The closing rate on those people was extremely low, and it was essentially wasting the closer's time that the closer could have spent speaking to a lead who was making over 30K a year. With the actual weight example, right, it just came down to pain. Someone who just needed to lose 5 kg, they didn't have as much pain. Someone who needed to lose 20 kg, they have more pain, right? Or 50 kg or more, because it's like they have a bigger risk and they know it, right? And they also know it because they have to live with that weight every single day. And then for the finances, we reverse engineered the job question, and we tested this question in different points in the script. I know some people like to qualify early. We tested that, but that just caused a drop off, right? Because for every question you're going to have in a DM setting script, there's going to be a certain drop off. So we needed to plug that question in where we would have the least amount of drop off. And we plugged it in right after the time confirmation. So it's like someone would get booked, the setter would say, hey, you're confirmed. But before the setter would actually book that person onto the calendar, they would send this question, right? And we positioned the entire job question as an external stressor question, because stress does lead to weight gain, as well as sedentary drops, right? If you're sitting in a chair all day, you're not moving around, you're more likely to gain weight if you're not taking care of yourself. So we started asking this question after someone already committed to the time, and this was the point in the script where it was the least amount of drop off, and it worked really well. And then if someone was disqualified and they said they're unemployed, the setter, didn't have to cancel a call because they never actually booked an event in the first place. They would just financially vet them or send them to a scholarship or send them to a low ticket. Now, the absolute final thing we did that was pivotal for the setters and the closers as a whole was adding a AI conversation review, right? So closers lacked clarity on leads' backgrounds, and also setters, again, they were at times booking unqualified leads just to book a call. So we added this AI con review bot that would summarize the conversation. It would talk about how long the lead has been struggling, the pain the lead has, the desires, and then it would also summarize their qualification status. Are they underweight? Are they overweight? As well as their job status. And first of all, this made it very clear to a setter if he booked an unqualified lead and he would just cancel it so the closer wouldn't waste their time. Second of all, it would just help closers better prepare for the call. They didn't have to read through the entire conversation. They were just able to look at the summary and then take the call from there. Now, after solving and optimizing the entire setting process, the next step was optimizing our organic marketing channels, because that was lacking. We didn't really have anything being done besides one thing, which I'll talk about in the group. And this was where we were driving people to, right, with a free community funnel, close to 50K people with pretty much no conversion process. We had an email list with 30,000 people not being touched, a 20K IG that was underutilized, not much happening on the Instagram. And there was also a YouTube channel that was completely underutilized. It had about 1,000 subscribers at the time. This led to the split being 95% cold traffic and 5% organic, even though we had so much organic opportunity. So we solved this from the order of highest leverage to lowest leverage, right? The highest leverage thing we had was the Facebook group. That's where we had the most people, and that's what we took over first. So first thing we did is we noticed the bottlenecks, right? There was no consistent conversion mechanism in the group. The way we solved this is by doing two-step posts. Very simple, right? Very simple posts. And then when we would do these two-step posts, we would have a VA that was assigned to a setter, okay, doing responses to all the comments. So when someone would comment, a VA would then reply to that comment. And then the setter would take over after a reply. And the reason we did this is, again, because we wanted to give the setters as much leverage as possible, especially on Facebook, right? The setter shouldn't be doing simple work like replying copy and paste messages to people commenting on a post, right? Requesting a free guide. The setter shouldn't also be doing follow-ups. That's just how I see it, because that's a lower leverage activity, unless it's a very hot lead that they need to do a super personalized follow-up with. That's why we got VAs to do this. And that's pretty much how it stayed on Facebook as well as Instagram. We just had VAs doing all the grunt work in order to save the setters time and make them more higher leverage, and also give them time to put more focus on having genuine conversations with people. The next bottleneck was personal account messages would keep getting hit. We had one Facebook account, so we got 5 accounts to 5x our organic messaging limits through Messenger. We needed to transfer people from our organic to SMS Some of the people just didn't exist. We didn't have their number, or their numbers have changed. We didn't have their email in the pipeline, right? Even though they were in the Facebook group. So we started transferring the person to our pre-booking. Before someone would get booked, the setter would say, in order to book you in, I do need to confirm your phone number as well as email so I can send you XYZ. The other thing was there was no organization in Messenger, right? Messenger doesn't have a pipeline like Alloware or GHL. So we started using Messenger Organizer, and this is where we also were able to filter people with organic tags. We had follow-up 1, follow-up 2, follow-up 3 for all the follow-up steps. And again, we had a 1 VA per setter to do the actual follow-ups, use Messenger Organizer and organize people. And they were doing basically all the copy and paste stuff in order to improve setter efficiency. And this also solved setter overload. The next thing that we dialed in is the weekly webinars, right? Now, the weekly webinars, these were essentially like workshops that the creator was running, and he was running them for as long as the group existed. And this significantly improved the organic presence, but these people weren't really getting converted the best way possible. So we started, again, doing a 2-step method with people commenting under the weekly webinar, the VA reaching out to them, and then when they replied to our message, the setter would take over. Another thing we ran was scholarships, right? So we would do essentially like giveaway scholarships for the holidays, for specific events. For example, before the summer, right? A few months before the summer, we did a scholarship giving away X amount of money in prizes, not prizes, but literally like tuition, right? Like scholarships, in order for people to get in shape before the summer. Right. And that drove a lot of traffic. And that doesn't mean we discounted people's programs, or doesn't mean we gave them the programs for free. Right. It means we just took a few $100 off the program, and we just made it more accessible. And it just drove a ton of cash flow through the business. And it wasn't positioned as a discount. Right. We're not doing a discount. It was positioned as a scholarship, which I actually think is better, because a lot of people were under the assumption that this could actually be free. And then through our conversion process and setting, we were able to reframe that as well as on the sales call and actually sell them onto the program. People who would have never bought before or would have bought down the line, and extended their sales cycle. So we started doing things like, if you refer a friend, you're going to get a gift card, or your friend's going to get X amount of money off the program. And this, again, just decreased our total cost per acquisition through the ecosystem, because these were free clients. Then we took care of the Instagram, as that was a huge priority. We started actually posting reels on the Instagram, which wasn't really being done consistently. These were lead magnet reels, and then VA or ManyChat would DM all the comments, and then the setter would take over after the reply. And we started doing conversion and nurturing stories, because stories were just not used whatsoever. And this is an example from another client, but essentially the structure for these conversion stories was problem/desire in the first slide to get the person's attention, then the epiphany or knowledge gap in order to get the desire or solve that problem, then dialing in on the solution of getting to that desire, or solving that problem, then CTA, right? That's how we ran it. And then another thing we did was these result stories. Now, with these stories, what they would do is the conversion story specifically just literally generated leads, because people would reply. We had CTAs at the end of the story, or we ran polls as well, by the way, right? So we had a poll in the first story, are you struggling with XYZ? And then a VA would reach out to people who would vote on the poll, and that would just generate leads. Now, the other thing we did was, specifically with the result stories, we were spamming these pretty much every single day. And we just built a lot of trust, because if you think about it, when someone becomes a lead, or more specifically, when someone books a call with you, what are they typically going to do? What are you typically going to do, right? You're going to research who you booked the call with. So we understood that, and we gave them more information to research about, right? So when someone would book a call with us, a lot of those people would go to our Instagram, they would go to our socials, and boom, they see a result story, right? That builds trust and shows them that we're legit pre-call, even in just the entire setting process, right? While they're being set. If they have some concerns that, maybe this is a scam, right? It's a lower trust market. It's an older audience. They'd be able to go to our Instagram, see proof, and get reactivated, right? So this is something that served leads and nurtured leads at all stages. It's a very important mechanism that a lot of people miss, because they don't really think about what leads do outside of the setting conversation, outside of your book a call via cell phone. And with this email list, we sent value, we broke beliefs, we handled objections, and we did this continuously, right? And then what we did as well that I think is super important in the emails is we had a CTA to reply to the email. We didn't send people to links, and we actually placed a dedicated email setter who literally just focused on the 100+ or more email replies that we would get every single day. we tested links versus replies. Links had lower deliverability because I actually don't know. I guess the setters can, I guess the servers can see links as scammy, but that wasn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem was, it was an older ICP, so they would have tech problems. There was more friction with a link. They would have to go to a page. They would have to understand the page. So we just took away that friction from the process by just having them reply, right? Replying to an email is just one button. You just click one button, actually two, right? The reply button and the send button, and you're done, right? And emails ended up accounting for 10% of our organic sales when they were fully ramped up. Now, another thing that we did with the emails was segmentation. We segmented the emails in a very specific manner. And a lot of people just, again, forget about their email list. They don't really do this, even if they are running a newsletter. What we did is we tracked the average amount of emails opened, right? Meaning like how many times a person on average has to open an email in order for them to book a call, right? From the email. That number was pinned at 18. That number later went down, but initially was pinned at 18. So we started segmenting everyone who has opened 18 emails and hasn't booked a call yet. And we would send them text blasts, right? Because if we have their email, because they opted in from the free community funnel, we had their number. And then we would send these people to the setter, right? So just more lead flow from just the leads we already had. And finally, with the YouTube, right? This was another huge organic channel. We started leveraging the YouTube for objection and belief breaking videos. Again, we saw this as something that people will, again, research before their call when they're in a sales process with us. We also leveraged this YouTube in the pre-call because we had the pre-call assets hosted on the YouTube channel. So they would watch one video, and then after watching it, they would get recommended other videos from us, right? And they would consume and consume and consume more and just trust us more, right? And believe us more. We posted testimonials on this channel, and we funneled people to the free community, right? If someone wasn't yet in our free community, we funneled people from the YouTube channel because this channel also grew, right? It went from 1K to 8K subscribers in a little bit over a year. And we started just getting leads from it as well. Literally just free money, right? There's no ad spend on this. And the CTA is essentially, if you want the specific resource that I talked about or the specific training about what I talked about in this video, join the community below. And they would join, and then they would just literally go into this optimized setting funnel. Now, that is how we solved the organic bottlenecks. The next bottleneck was tracking. The entire operation was pretty much running blind, right? There was nothing being tracked. And if there was, it was very inconsistent tracking. And it was just kind of like a guessing game of what decisions should be made, what should we do. So that needed to be solved. And so we started tracking every single metric in the process, which I'll get into here shortly. And what this allowed us to do is just spot bottlenecks, right? Because we were able to see from the top of our funnel to the bottom of a funnel, right, where someone becomes a sale and even a back-end sale, we were able to see where is their breakage, right? And this way, we weren't just jumping around different tasks in the business trying to put out different fires. We knew exactly what was the main fire in the business at exactly what time that was causing our revenue to stay stuck or us not to scale as fast as possible, or what we could optimize in order to scale faster, right? We were able to always see the weakest metric. So we tracked absolutely everything. And the main metric we looked at with the free community funnel, or at least one of them, was our lead to sale rate, right? Because these people were opting for the free community, and our goal was to always be at a 2% plus lead to sale. That's when we were extremely profitable and everything was running great. And the extremely green territory where we were crushing it was 3% lead to sale, meaning every 3 people out of 100 people who opt in become clients. And that's something we were able to maintain month over month. That was variable, but we were always focused on staying above 2% lead to sale. And so the numbers we started tracking initially, right, with an initial tracking sheet, ad spend today, average ad spend, leads in. This is something you can also track with organic reach numbers, right? You can find these in your insights. If you don't run ads, you can replicate this. We're able to track things like our cost per call, all these important metrics, which you can pause and see right here. The other thing that was super important in the process was tracking lead quality and how lead quality fluctuated, because at the end of the day, it was a free community funnel, right? They were opting in for a freebie. And that all depended at the scale we were at. And all of that depended as we scaled on these free community funnel people, leads, right, being qualified. And the way we did that was with a bad fit tag, right? So we were just able to measure over X amount of time, how many bad fits do we get? And if that number would go up, then we would know, okay, something's up with the ads. We need to make some changes. If it was just like a 1 day fluctuation, we would wait typically 3 to 4 days before making any decisions. And the bad fits were qualified based on weight, right? So are we getting people who are just too light, right? They just don't have enough pain to get help. We're getting people who don't make enough money, right? This is what we were measuring with a bad fit tag. And just to give you an example of how the tracking influences decisions is when we added a phone setting team, right? We had phone setters spend 45 seconds on every dial they made. They were using Allaware, right? This restricted them at a certain pickup rate to only 40 leads per hour when doing double dials. And this is if no one picked up the phone, right? So the obvious answer here was to shorten the dial time. But instead of stopping there, because in Allaware you can control how long your outbound dial time is for, right? So you can set it to be 20 seconds, 10 seconds, right? That means like how many rings before it just goes to voicemail for the person. And instead of just, guessing it, we actually tested 25 seconds versus 35 seconds. And after a few days, we had the metrics show that we could actually go on the shorter side. 25 seconds won after factoring in the amount of leads we could call with the saved time. And then we had another roadblock. 50% of the live calls got lost to objections, right? So when someone would pick up, 50% of those calls that the setters were speaking to would just either hang up on them or say it's not the right time. And of all the objections, half of the time we noticed that the phone setters heard that people were just saying it's the wrong time, right? It's not a good time to talk. So instead of giving the setters a generic script to handle this, I divided this. So instead of giving the setters a generic script to handle this, I've dived into a rabbit hole, and the setters received script variations to keep these prospects on the phone. Then we ran another test, tracked the numbers, and after a few days of data collection, we had a winner, a script that kept most of the wrong time prospects on the phone. And that increased our booking rate as a result, right? Without precise tracking on the things you optimize your entire business, optimizations like this just aren't possible, which is why we went so heavy on tracking. And then this sheet was succeeded by HubSpot and a simpler metric tracker that we still used in Google Sheets, just some cross-reference the data, where we tracked our low ticket, right? I'm going to get into the low ticket shortly, cost per lead, cost per call, cost per sale, and then a few more metrics here. And then with the group funnel, we tracked the booking rate, cost per call show rate, cost per live call, of course, our lead to sale, that very, very important metric. And we tracked a 7-day average. And we also tracked the phone setting team, cut the phone setting team out. And then we had another tracker, just a custom dashboard within HubSpot that gave us all this data as well. Right, so after the tracking was dialed in, there was another bottleneck, right? And this is something we actually noticed because of the tracking. And that bottleneck was our booking rate. It typically hovered between 8 to 10%. And in order to get our lead to sale up and just run a more profitable company, we need to increase this, right? And we need to decrease the amount of leads slipping through the cracks, right? Because I've noticed that there were more leads we could convert out of the same leads we had, right? So we just could do more. It was always a question of how could we optimize the conversion process to be better and then do more of it, right? So we started a dialing team. And the initial goal of the entire dialing team was to literally just support the DM setting team by calling unresponsive SMS leads, because that wasn't really happening besides the voicemail drops, which weren't actually calls, they were just voicemail drops. And later on, this progressed into speed to lead dialing. The biggest constraints with the dialing team was that we were calling older women who were uncomfortable discussing weight loss issues over the phone, right? They would be at work, they would be at a dinner, they would be with their husband, their family, and they just simply didn't feel comfortable talking about how they feel ashamed of themselves every single day in the mirror, understandably, right? So to solve this, we looked at what are our optimal dialing times, again, through tracking in terms of where we're getting the least amount of wrong times. I can't talk about this right now, right? And we came down to 5 p.m. to 9 p.m., 10 a.m. This was the most optimal. This was typically just because, this is when people were home in a private environment, 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. and 7 a.m. to 9 a.m., right? And this constraint just really aligned with, the offer itself, because the DM setting team was able to be so optimized and run up this entire offer to the level it did because it was just a discreet way of communicating for these women, right? You're able to text, no one sees it. You're able to do it at work. You're not going to talk over the phone over these issues. We fine-tuned the entire script to sound like they were talking to their grandson or their granddaughter. These were older women, right? The structure was intro, discovery, and by this I just mean like the tonality, like how you would speak to your grandmother or another granny, right? That's what we did with the script. In terms of structure, typical dialing script, right? Intro, discovery, into their current situation, breakdown of what is it that we do, financial/time qualification. We went into their goals a little bit, commitment, and then breakdown of how we do and why it works and why it could help them. The next constraint became the dialer booked calls. All the calls they booked just completely tanked in terms of show up rate, right? And they averaged a much lower show up rate than the DM setters. And we attributed this to a few things, which allowed us to add a 3 yes commitment script. So 3 yeses: commitment to attend at the specific time, commitment to consume pre-call resources, and the commitment to take the call seriously. And we positioned the call to actually improve this framing, right? We positioned this as a $250 call or pound call, UK offer, right? That we're giving to them for free because of XYZ, because they're special. And then the dialers would also keep personalized SMS conversations with a person between booking and the call, right? So they reference personal details. How was your grandson's graduation, right? How was the trip, the hiking trip you took to Scotland? Things like this, right? And at the same time, they nudge them to watch the pre-call materials. And that's also something that post-booking sequence did. The next constraint with the dialing team was the leads who were being booked had low intent. So the dialers started softly pitching the coaching program. They mentioned there would be a cost. They mentioned what we do. They expanded on the fact that, yes, you're in the free community, but this is a coaching program. And the entire process was essentially broken into 4 dialers working along with 12 DM setters. The dialers' priorities in terms of lead lists was people pitched by the DM setters who didn't book a call, follow-up, and DNC/ghost leads, right? People who ghosted us, and new leads where phone contact was appropriate, right? In these optimal dialing times. And then because the dialers were speaking to less qualified leads in terms of colder leads, right? Specifically colder leads, their conditional base was set at 6 sales, and this essentially just made it fair game between the dialers and the setters. And another crucial factor that I need to mention is where you dial matters, right? So we started dialing on Alloware, but Alloware had a lot of friction. They didn't have a very smooth dialing experience, right? And the goal was, to increase these people's performance. We just needed to make their lives easier, right? Show them that we care. And obviously that just resulted in more revenue for us, right? So we started using dialer.io. It's CRM, right? They can just literally click a button and it just keeps calling people. It's like Power Dialer. It has good speed to lead. It was just directly connected to our HubSpot as well as Alloware, and we would just have instant speed to lead for new leads. Has a better pickup rate and a better number health, and that's because they rotate numbers. So great software. I recommend it. And of course, as we scale this, just like we did with the setters, we hired and trained a team lead for the dialers. Now, again, this wasn't a manager. It was literally someone in the trenches who was just the top performer leading the dialing team. Now, the next thing I want to move on to is, of course, the low ticket funnel, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and funnel improvement, right? So we improved the sales process. Now we needed to improve the actual throughput so we could use that sales process to convert more people. And the first thing that we did was just looking at, the opt-in page. That was where all the traffic was coming from. The opt-in page used to be this outdated opt-in page, didn't really have much to it. And while it performed in 2021, when the business was starting, at this point it was hovering at 15 to 18%. So we hired a funnel designer for speed to be able to test new funnels and essentially beat the control. This was a long-standing control. The new page, which is here, which I'm about to break down, performed upwards of 37%. On this new page, we had urgency, bonus, free fat loss starter kit, expires, and this was literally just the next day. So there was a 24-hour custom code, 98% success rate, social proof. This was the same headline. This headline was, we just couldn't beat it, right? With a sub-headline, handle objections without fads, strict diets, and hours of exhausting exercise, benefit-oriented button. Then we had authority below the button, right? Delivered by dietitians, qualified dietitians, psychologists, and psychotherapists. Social proof, then more urgency. If I don't do this now, I never will. Again, I want to remind you this ICP was specifically someone who, has been putting off weight loss typically or has tried and failed before and just couldn't get to experience the success of losing weight. And then we had our benefit stack of what they're going to get inside. A big key learning with the funnel were these images, right? The social proof. The old funnel just had one image. Here we mixed in more, right? So that people would see familiarity. Oh, this lady looks just like me. Oh, she was the same size as me, right? Which improved our opt-in rate. And the key learning here was only using after images, right? We used to use before and after images. We tested that. That performed far worse than just using these after pictures of people who've lost weight. And then below these images, we had quotes with desires, right? Then after opting in, this is something we set up, is a WhatsApp redirect, right? This is something I'm going to talk about here as well. So when someone would opt in, instead of going to the Facebook group, which was what this old funnel page did, directing them to the Facebook group, the Facebook group invite would be sent through email, right? Instead, we started redirecting them to WhatsApp. And this literally just created another touch point. So they would land on this page after putting in their information here. This would load for 4 seconds and just auto redirect them to messages on WhatsApp. The reason we did this was because everyone in the UK uses WhatsApp, pretty much everyone. Majority of the opt-ins would be on mobile, and it was easy for them to get redirected to the app. They would receive a message from us right away, an automated message. Again, another touch point, and this increased our total reply rate. So counting emails, dialers, SMS, and WhatsApp, of course, here as well. And then in terms of follow-ups on WhatsApp, we use the same VA system for follow-ups and giving more levers to the setters as we did on Facebook. Now, I want to take a little bit of time of talking about what we did with the low ticket. The reason we added a low ticket offer, and this can contradict, right, where people say you can scale to $1 million a month with just one funnel, which I do believe is true. You could, right? But when we were hitting $700,000, $800,000 a month, we added in a low ticket funnel. We decided to test something new, right? The community funnel would break at 4 to 5K in spend a day. The lead quality would go, it would just become garbage. And the solution became starting a second low ticket funnel to diversify. And the hypothesis behind the lead quality was the fact that at a certain spend, you kind of max out your targeting for those perfect leads that work for your funnel, right? And we were only targeting the UK. It's a UK-based offer. And the lead quality would just drop because Facebook essentially bridges out of targeting people in this one box where it's like everyone is qualified, right? Maybe not everyone is qualified, but the ratios work in terms of ROAS and profitability. And it kind of bridges out of this box, right? It crosses the line. And that's what would happen to us. We would scale past 4 or 5K a day and we would just see a significant drop. So we, of course, started the low ticket funnel. And a later solution to this was doing a negative targeting list. Because we had all these DQ bad fit leads stacked up, right? People who didn't have enough weight to lose, people who weren't financially qualified. And we just put that as a negative list into Facebook, right? So these were people, and by that I mean we created a lookalike audience for this negative list, and we essentially told Facebook to avoid targeting them. But in terms of the low ticket funnel, the low ticket funnel was launched at £17 plus 2 order bumps, right? It was a course. The order bump 1 was an accountability group where they would get access to just a group for the low ticket, right? That would keep them accountable, and it's essentially like a community. The second order bump was a 7-day trial to subscription newsletter at £37 per month. So after the trial ends, the subscription starts. And of course, we maximized this newsletter because inside of the newsletter, the whole newsletter was literally just focused on sending them into the actual high ticket. Running this low ticket required constant split test. The CVR, the conversion rate peaked at about 4%. And this is what the original low ticket funnel looked like. Now, just as a side note, before I break this down, for the majority of the time, we ran the low ticket funnel without a VSL, right? But the rest of the page was pretty much the same. We had our urgency to lead to the impulse purchase. When people buy low tickets, it's typically an impulse purchase. We had novelty in the pre-headline or eyebrow line and the headline itself that promised to solve their pain. More novelty here, right? Breakthrough system, authority, expert curated, fast for fat loss system, urgency, discount expires, another discount for impulse, button with a benefit in it. Yes, I'm ready to drop 2 dress sizes, risk reversal, in both of these, and then more social proof right under the VSL. And then we literally just had more proof, a bullet stack of benefits, features and benefits of the course, and that was pretty much the page, right? So then when someone would buy, they would go to the next page, which was a onboarding call page, right? This is what resulted in us having a high ascension rate, which I'm going to talk about here as well, with a low ticket. And this ascension call was actually pitched on the low ticket itself, right? So it was literally part of the offer, right? They bought the low ticket. This was part of the offer. So we got them to book this ascension call. It was just an assessment call. That's the way it was positioned. But in reality, this was a triage call to see if they're qualified. So this was a great idea. And this is something we originally did, but it did backfire because the older ladies would struggle with tech. And we changed this to go to the course directly, right? The reason we did this is to reduce chargebacks. We increased consumption because after they went to the course directly, they would just literally start watching the course. This built more trust, and we increased ascension, right? So we made the low ticket leads to increase ascension the priority for the dialers. So now instead of the assessment call being on this page, right away they would be called by a dialer after purchasing. They were prioritized in all the lists, and a dialer would take over from there and book them on to a sales call if they were a good fit. In terms of the results, the low ticket worked incredibly well until 1.5 to 2K per day in spend. It was mainly converting leads who made a first touch point in the group funnel, right? So what happened was unintentionally, right? We weren't running a retargeting ad. A good portion of the leads coming in and buying the low ticket or even opting into it looked at or were in our group funnel previously, right? After 1.5 to 2K a day in spend, the CVR conversion rate would plummet. And with the low ticket, we booked 20% of all opt-ins / sales on calls, right? Because there's a 2-step order form, right, on this page, meaning they would first have to opt in, then put their credit card details, right? So this aggregates both of those numbers into one. We had a 10 to 12% ascension rate, peaking at 15% for a little bit. The low ticket show up rate was 20% higher on average than our group funnel show up rate. And this is all because, right, the ascension rate being that crazy, because it had a 45, 55% closing rate consistently. Our group funnel was averaging around 30, 32, 33%. Low ticket was pretty much close to double that, right? And again, a lot of that gets attributed to the low ticket not being the first touch point. A lot of that gets attributed to the trust building that the actual cores did, and the fact that these people had an investment mindset, right? They weren't coming in for a freebie. They were already purchasing something to solve their problem, and they were more likely to spend more money because they were existing customers. Now, when someone would become a customer, the next thing we dialed in was our ascension process. And the dialed in ascension process, it's actually pretty simple, but it works extremely well. Right? We found out what is the perfect time to call leads in the program in order to book them for an ascension call. It's not at the end of the program, right? The reason it's not at the end of the program is 6 months. We started calling them at 6 to 8 weeks in the program of them being in the course, right? In the coaching program on the front end. Reason behind it is because when they're 6 to 8 weeks in the program, they still have the pain that got them to join in the first place, but they also have more trust and they've started to see some wins. They've started to see some results, making that ascension a lot easier, right? So 6 to 8 weeks into the program, there was a backend dialer that would call them. That dialer would also work with the coaches, right? The coaches would say, hey, this person is ready for ascension. They've lost X amount of weight. They're seeing these results, and they would book them with a dialer, right? This wasn't happening 6 months after they joined the program because the person would have already won, right? And the dialer would schedule them on a check-in call. I do have to make a note as well. The actual creator was taking these ascension calls, right? The creator's brilliant at sales. And then when those calls would be taken, which were also outsourced to other closers down the line, right? The creator just didn't have the bandwidth. We had a 70% upsell rate onto a $9,000 program, right? So the front end was 2,200 pounds, which is about 3K. The back end was 7,500 pounds, which is $9,000. And of course, this was able to get broken up into payment plans. And this backend program is just a 2-year program. It's an extension. And the way it's positioned, at least one of the big angles is, sustainability. The entire funnel, right, is based on sustainable weight loss. We're targeting people who have struggled before, who haven't been able to do it. So the backend upsell just not guaranteed, but it increased the probability of them succeeding long term and not regaining this weight, right? Because that's happened to most of the people who joined this program, the front end program, multiple times before, right? They've lost weight, they regained it, and they stayed struggling. And the backend upsell was a way to keep their habits, keep reinforcing their habits, right? Keep getting coaching. There were obviously also some other bonus deliverables, which I won't disclose. But yeah, big angle was just this, right? Most people, just 80-95% of people will regain the weight within a few years after losing it. This increased the probability that this just doesn't happen to them. And that's why it performs so well. Now, last but not least, a very important part of our sales process was the show up rate, because this was a constant battle, I would say, right? And it's closer to the bottom of the funnel, right? Our call show rate was inconsistent. It was typically between 50 to 70%, especially at the start. The Google Sheet here is missing. I don't know why, but this got to 89%. We started seeing show up rates upwards of 89% on a monthly basis, right? So it wasn't like a one-day thing where everyone shows up. We started seeing it on a monthly basis, consistently over 80%. And the whole framework behind improving the show up rate was understanding this, right? The call with your team, the call with our team needed to outweigh all the other things these people could do. going to the gym, right? As an example, drinking, going to dinner, watching Netflix, it needed to outweigh that, right? The call needed to be more valuable. So the first thing that we did to increase the show up rate was doing something before the actual call was even booked, right? And it was changing the positioning of the call. We started pitching the call as something that's going to give them the first few actionable steps to losing this weight. And we gave them a fear of missing out. The other important thing with booking these calls was not booking people. This was a big problem before, right? People would get booked 1 week out. We stopped booking people further than 72 hours out unless requested or unless there was some sort of exception with someone, which typically didn't happen, right? So if you have an auto booking page, this is harder to do. So just set a time limit to 72 hours. We were booking in calls manually, right? I have to note that. The setters were taking a time from the prospect that worked for them and then booking it onto the calendar. Big reason for that is, again, older avatar, there would be tech issues with the link, all these things. So we just did it manually. And then something we used for everyone who couldn't book within 72 hours out, because that obviously happens, was a Google Calendar. There was just a team calendar with the closer's availability where the setters were able to waitlist leads if someone couldn't book within 72 hours. So for example, if it's a Monday and someone says, I'm on vacation until next Monday, instead of booking that person for next Monday and then just risking them not showing up, right? Based on the data, this entire thing was based on the data. We just looked at the data of when does our show up rate just drop significantly. It was that 72-hour mark. Instead of doing that, the setters would put them on a wait list for Sunday where they would send them a follow-up to see if they're still good for the call, right, to get booked for tomorrow. And that just increased their show up rate. And then that way the call stayed top of mind for the person. And the way that was positioned was just the setter saying, hey, we're booked out from X day. That X day was typically the day after 72 hours, right? So if it's a Monday, the setter would say, we're booked out from Thursday onwards. I will send you a message if a slot gets freed up. That also changed the framing of the call as well. And the Google Calendar was also used to color code leads, right? Qualified, disqualified, no-show, canceled, and hot leads. Just different things that allowed the sales team to function better. Now, the second step became improving pre-call consumption. The reason this became the main focus of pretty much the entire funnel was because these people were joining for a freebie, right? They weren't watching a VSL. They weren't getting pre-framed in any sort of way or form. So we needed to focus on consumption to build trust, to build likability, and to also create authority, right? So the whole pre-call process just became focused on that, as well as the follow-ups themselves, right? And we built out a confirmation page. We had our pre-headline here, which created authority. We had steps in terms of the confirmation page itself of what they need to do in order to create an easy process to follow. This video here was a 60-minute asset on 8 myths of weight loss, which was in reality just pre-handling the 8 biggest objections we would get on sales calls. We had more authority of where the company was mentioned. And then we had 2 testimonials aimed at people at different stages in their journey. And we framed these testimonials as watch these before your call. That way we can get your takeaways and see what worked for these people. Tell us who you relate to the most, right? And then we can actually implement that into your weight loss strategy. We then had step 3, which was a nurturing asset, right? If they weren't in the group yet, we would get them in there. That group was huge. There was a ton of posts coming in there. They would just build more social proof. Confirming the call on their calendar was important, right? These were older people. We needed to make sure they did this. And then more framing of how they needed to join the call. And then the FAQ. These were literally just objections, right? So is there any cost for the call? Cost objection. I've got a million things. This was the biggest objection, just time, not enough time, right? These are busy people. They're older. They have kids, grandkids. Do I really have time to do this? This was the whole just breakout FAQ, handling objections. And then just dozens of testimonials under step 7 here. And all of the resources on this page were literally just framed as assets that are just going to give them some quick wins before they even join the call. Some quick actionable steps they can start implementing to start seeing progress before they even take their call. Down the line, there were 2 more things added to the confirmation page. One was meet the team, right, to create more authority, literally all the fulfillment team on the page. And we had a meet the founder video with the founder/creator of the program introducing himself. And of course, in terms of follow-ups themselves, we needed to reframe these, right? The follow-ups pre-call, the goal wasn't to annoy people and just bother them about their call time. Hey, your call is coming up. It was to lead with value, right? Increase consumption, as I mentioned. So we would first get their commitment to watching the resources pre-call, we would ask them for permission to send them, which increased their likelihood of actually watching them because it was their own idea to get the resources. When booked in, we would send that sales asset page, and then we would send this message right here. And then also pre-call, we asked people to set an alarm or put it in their diary, their calendar, to make sure that they make it on time, right? This is something that dialers did as well, because again, these were older people. They would miss the calls for different reasons. The whole time pre-call, they would get emails. These would break beliefs. They would establish credibility. They would educate the prospects with elements of one-sentence persuasion. And then another crucial thing that was added once the dialing team was set up was a confirmation dial. Now, there was 2 confirmation dials. The first one happened right when someone would book in. And when they would book in, within 10 minutes, they're getting a call from the team to confirm they're making their call. But more importantly, that 5-minute call, right? It was a 4 to 5 minute call after they would book, didn't necessarily focus on just bothering and annoying them about the call time. It focused on making sure they get the resources and just creating commitment around those resources, right? So we would get yeses from the person that they're going to watch the resources. We would get their understanding of why these resources are so important. As I said, the goal was consumption, right? And that's what the dialers did. And for this, we hired 2 admin dialers on the team. Their full-time role was literally just doing confirmation calls. After someone would book a call, we would make sure they're getting called. And the entire time, 90% of the time, these admin dialers would literally just be drilling the people on the importance of the resources and how much the resources are actually going to benefit them before their call even begins. And as a byproduct, if someone watches, 2 hours, 3 hours of your content before a call, they're going to remember they have a call with you. If a person didn't pick up, the confirmation dialer, the admin dialer, would leave a voicemail. And then there was also one more confirmation call if the person didn't confirm through text that they're showing up to the call, that they watched the resources the night before their call, right? So if someone's booked for Tuesday, the admin dialer would call them Monday evening, and that admin dialer would confirm, hey, are you still making the call? Hey, have you been able to watch those free trainings we sent you? And if the person hasn't watched them, the dialer would reinforce the importance of watching them before their call, right? If the person didn't pick up, typically this is where we would just cancel the call and refill it with another appointment for the sake of saving the closer's time. Because if a person didn't pick up, if a person wasn't responsive, after 1, 2, 3 days of follow-ups, we would cancel their call, refill it, and just use that time slot. Because that show up rate, if they just responded to 0 touch points, right? They didn't respond to an email, no text message, no WhatsApp, no response to our dialer or the voicemail, the show up rate was terrible, right? So we just would typically cancel those calls. And if the person would show up to the call, then we would reschedule them. Now, in terms of the follow-ups themselves, again, all the follow-ups were about the resources. Have you had a chance to go through the resource? If so, what's your biggest takeaway? I always welcome all and any feedback. If you haven't gone through that, please go through before our call. Not really pushing the call on them. Any questions or feedback about the training's name, right? Not pushing the call, just pushing the resources. We're trying to come off as a value provider. Now, the final thing we had to do for the entire funnel at a certain point, as well as our show up rate, because we dialed this process in. It was working great, right? We were getting 80% plus show up rates consistently, month over month, hitting 89% one month, right? It became our public relations with our customers, right? What happened was people started doing post-booking research and canceling. Why? Because someone created a Trustpilot on our behalf. We didn't have a Trustpilot. And they left a bad review and price dropped the program, right? People didn't know the price of the program before the call. Our SMS number would also get spam or scam flagged due to the amount of volume we were sending, thousands of messages per day, right? Including all the conversations. To solve this, it was easy. We just kept monitoring the number health and rotating the numbers. But in terms of solving the public relations issue, and when I mean this was an issue, our show up rate tanked by like 30%. We went down to 50% week over week. We just didn't know what to do, right? So we had to understand, what were our prospects checking pre-call? We had to understand, where were they doing their research? Why were they canceling? The Trustpilot became the obvious factor. But we thought, well, what else could we do besides the Trustpilot itself, right? How can we fix this? So the first thing was the Instagram stories. We doubled down on the consistent results stories, because they would do that pre-call research. They would see our Instagram story. They would trust us more, right? Because we had Instagram stories with results every single day. If you have any questions, feel free to scroll down below, DM me on Instagram. It's probably in the description and comment section. If you're looking to implement any of these systems here on a done-for-you basis, I do run a done-for-you agency where we'll come in, build any of these systems out within 7 to 14 days. And even if you don't have an offer yet, or you haven't properly launched an offer, or your offer is just not converting, we'll come in and relaunch it, right? And this is something we've done for multiple clients. We'll just do it for you. Whether you just don't have enough time, or you just don't have the time to learn how to do it yourself, book a call down below using the page below, and we'll speak to you soon. Otherwise, again, DM me on IG for questions. And I'm excited to see you scale.